Today on the bench, we're going to be working on an RC four-wheel drive TF2. We're actually going to be converting it using a product that I designed and Boom Racing is producing, which is the TF2 LWB or long wheelbase conversion kit. So let's get started.
What we've got here on the bench today is a completely stock RC four-wheel drive Trailfinder 2 or TF2. And in its stock configuration, it's set up for the Hilux body. What we have here in front is the new Boom Racing TF2 long wheelbase conversion kit. And what this allows you to do is to convert the standard TF2 or the short wheelbase TF2, which you typically see with the Jeep body, into the long wheelbase version so that you can run either the four-door Hilux body, you can run the Killer Body LC70 body, you can run pretty much any 313 millimeter wheelbase body once you install this conversion kit. And that's what we're going to be doing today. So to start off with, let's just take a quick look at the rails. These are the rails that are included in the kit. They're anodized black with the edges polished, Boom Racing laser etched into the frame. And all of these notches have a use. If you've never seen a TF2 frame before, most of the parts actually socket into various areas in the frame, which makes it a very strong frame. We also have a couple of cross braces, and we'll get into the specific use of these later and what their advantages are. We have a drive shaft extender, and we have the new high clearance skid plate, which gives you 7 millimeters more ground clearance in the center of the truck over the stock unit. And this actually is available as a separate part. You do not have to buy the whole frame kit just to get this. So if you want a little more performance in your TF2 and get a little more ground clearance, you can buy just this piece, swaps right in. Okay, so let's move these out of the way and we can take the body off. And then we'll begin tearing down the truck. So I'm going to take the body off and we won't be using that anymore. Alright, so this is a basically brand new truck that I am going to be converting. It has never been run more than a few feet outside, so you can see it's still very, very clean. And this truck has actually been loaned to me to do this conversion by Victor of the RC Ranch. So thanks, Victor, so that we can show what this conversion actually entails. The only thing that I've done to this truck so far is just to speed up time of the video. I've desoldered the motor. That way we don't have to spend time waiting for the soldering iron to heat up and so on. So in order to do the conversion, you're going to need a 1.5 millimeter wrench, a 2 millimeter wrench, a 2.5 millimeter wrench, and a 5.5 or a set of pliers. Those are pretty much all the pieces that you're going to need, all the tools you're going to need to get all the pieces off of this chassis kit. So we might as well start at the front, and we'll start with the bumper. So the bumper just comes off. Whether you bought your TF2 as a ready to run or as a kit, all of these parts are always the same. One of the things that I will recommend when you're doing a conversion like this is to take all of your screws and line them up in a way that makes sense to you. Now for me it makes sense. I'm going to have the truck sitting here, front bumper on my left, so I'm going to start with all the screws going back. And you can see here I've got those two screws, this side and this side. Okay, and we have a number of cable ties here all over the place to tidy up all of this wiring, and we're going to have to clip those off, unfortunately. But we can put them back on with new cable ties, of course. So just to keep everything neat and tidy, we'll only be clipping them off as we need to. That way we don't have a massive wiring just flying everywhere all of a sudden. Okay. All right. So. Now this one we can keep together because that's hooked to the winch controller, and we'll actually be able to take all of this off in one piece because it's not actually clipped to the chassis anywhere. The servo and wires here are clipped to the chassis, so those will need to come off. So we'll take that out. Got that one. That one, and we have one more here in the front. Nope, two more at least. Oh, lots more. Alrighty. Now we can disconnect the servo. Run that wire over there. We have our bumper here connected in. Now we have our battery straps. Okay. All right, so now one of the things that you can do with the TF2 is actually take out this portion of the drivetrain as one piece, and we're going to be doing that. It just makes the conversion a little bit easier. So the screws you're looking for are these two here on either side. There. Okay, and you see that just drop down a little bit. And then the next thing what you can do is actually to lift the truck up. And there's two screws underneath the transfer case. So if we hold on to the drivetrain, transmission and the motor, turn it over, and you can see these two screws here. Okay. Now if we switch over to the 1.5 millimeter, we can rotate the drive shafts and disconnect those. Alright, so those now will disconnect, and when we roll the truck back over, we can now lift this entire assembly out as one connected unit. This does not need to be disassembled any further than this in order to put it into the new rail system once we're complete with assembling that. So we can set this aside as one unit. The drive shafts at some point will fall apart just because they slide apart. So it's easiest if you just take those apart now. And in fact, one already did. So set those aside. Now, there's an electronics plate here, and the easiest thing to do is to actually lift that out as one unit. However, in order to do that, we need to disconnect the servo first. Whoops. And there, with the shift servo disconnected, you can see there's one more screw here, 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 and unfortunately there's also, I believe, one underneath the speed controller here. But we'll start with these three just to make sure. Being that I didn't assemble this truck, I'm not 100% certain that that one was used. And unfortunately it was, so that means we're going to have to free that from its double-sided tape there. So, take a look here. See if we can't do this by hand. A little gentle persuasion. There we are. And here's our final screw for that part of the electronics. And then this whole plate can actually lift off. Okay, so we get our motor wires with our speed control. The only thing that we're not getting here is our receiver. And that, unfortunately, also has been placed over a screw. So we're going to lift that up. And that allows us to remove all of the electronics in one pass, along with the front bumper. So, the next step that we need to take is to remove more of the components off of the top. Because the rails are hooked together with the cross pieces going into the rail itself, you need to remove things in a certain order, or at least in a certain fashion. And if you built yours from the kit, you'll know this. If you did not, or if you purchased one secondhand, check the instruction manual. It makes it the most clear. You can see how one side is assembled and then the other. Now, one of the things that you'll notice here with the stock kit, if I turn the truck on its side here, okay, and if I take something like this sheet of styrene just to show you, if this sheet of styrene is the bed of the truck, when I put the body on, it sits here. Now, we don't actually have the cover for the receiver box here, which is made to look like a gas tank or a fuel cell. But when I set that down, you can see here, even without the cover on, we're still sitting almost a centimeter or a half an inch above the frame rails. Okay. Now, part of that is because of the way the fuel cell box is mounted, fuel cell receiver box. Part of it's also because this rear shock brace actually goes up, over, and back down again. Okay. With the boom racing conversion kit, that actually doesn't happen. That entire brace is replaced. We are not going to reuse that brace, and we will flip around the receiver box. So what will wind up happening is that the receiver box will actually sit down lower between the frame rails, and the new rear shock tower brace actually sits flat and slightly below the rails. And what that means is that if you have a truck with a deep bed, then that bed can actually go all the way down to the level of frame rails, which means that the whole entire body can sit down lower on the chassis, which gives you a more realistic look. But also, if you have a heavy body because you have a lot of accessories or whatever else, it also gives you a lower center of gravity, which again increases the performance. So the next things we can take off, just starting at the back with some things that aren't connected to anything else, is we have the rear bumper mount. And this brace here is actually the body mount if you're using the standard Hilux body with the included mounts. This kit is actually not using the included mounts. It's using a different set of mounts. Now, what I can show you here is that this piece goes down to come out, okay, because it's socketed into the chassis rail. So you can see here it's flush, there's a line there, but if I were to actually take this out and show you, trying to set it down from the top doesn't work because you can see this little edge here. Okay, so we can set that one aside. The next two things we can take out are these round crossbars, because they're not connected to anything now that they are not holding the receiver box fuel cell. And then these are just a pressure fit between the rails. So you can just twist them and they'll rotate right out. Like so. Okay. Now we can move back to the front of the truck. What I'm trying to do here is to keep the truck as much supported on the wheels. It just makes it easier so when I let go of it, it doesn't fall over and flop down. So the next things we can take out are this front brace here, which is the first part of what holds the servo in place. And then the back portion of it actually connects through the shock towers, but because they have two screws each, you see here, one there and one there, those will actually still support themselves somewhat so that we can take those pieces out, hopefully as one unit. So that goes there. And we can lower that down. Now, this is obviously still connected to the steering linkage, but because we're going to reuse both of these pieces, we can try and leave that all right there. Hopefully it won't be too annoying and won't get in our way. Now, the next thing that we can remove is to start to remove part of the skid plate. So we have two screws here, one on either side. can take those out. And sometimes screws roll around, but for the most part in this kit, everything's about the same size until you get down to some of the end ones. The middle screws are generally about the same size. And again, it does give you all this information in the standard kit manual, and the standard kit manual does also apply to the long wheelbase rail kit. So the next thing that I'm going to take apart is going to be the rear end, and we have 2 screws on either side for the rear hanger for the spring, and that will just drop down. And these, you can see, are shorter screws. There. Okay. Now we can take out these 2 screws which hold the shocks on. Okay. Middle there. And then we'll take out the rear shock tower brace. Now technically we don't have to take this out, but what I want to do is to actually be able to show you the difference in the old rails versus the new rails. To be able to hold them side by side so you can see the differences. So that's why we're going to take everything apart here. With these. And this is, again, is slotted in, so it slides down to come out. Okay. And now what we want to do is to take out the leaf from the leaf hanger in the front part of the rear leaves, and we have to take off the hangers here, and again take out from the leaf itself, not the hanger, because the way these mount is inside the frame rail, and the only way to get at it is to do this kind of a thing, which really isn't good for your driver or the screw. Okay, so if you take out the actual screw that goes through the leaf itself, then that makes it much better. It's a little more work, but you're not going to twist the end of your driver, and you're not going to ruin the screw either. So this is where you need the 2.5 millimeter driver and the 5.5 millimeter wrench. Push the screw out and the spring will come out. And if you've never seen them before, the leaf screws are actually a stepped screw. So you have thread here and then flat. So we can put those right back in for right now. Okay. There we go. And with that, we can take out the entire rear end. We'll set that over here and continue on to take out the front. Okay. again, I'm just putting the screws right back through the eyelets at the end of the leaves so that when we go to put this back on the new rail kit, everything's all right there. And the only thing different with the front to the rear is on the rear end, again, if you've never done this before because you bought it ready to run or you bought it from somebody else, these are the hangers at the very, very back, and they have 2 screws that you can see that plug in to the frame rail. On the front, however, you have a different kind of hanger, which has a shackle. That's what it's called here. So we take out the top screw. Okay. And one more. Okay, and again, we're going to reuse our shock tower mounts, so we can come in and just take off those screws directly. There we go. So now we can lift the frame rails off. We can take the entire front end assembly and set that aside as well. Okay. Now, so that leaves us with our frame rails, which are hooked together with basically just the skid plate here hanging. And this, on this particular case, is using these 2 plastic mounts, which are a body mount, to hold everything in place. So if you unscrew those and set those aside, the frame rail comes off. Then on the other side, you now have access to your screws without having to put your driver off at some strange angle and potentially strip the head of the screw or round off your driver. Okay, so we'll set those there. Now this brings us to the first thing that I'm going to show you once we take these 2 long screws out of our skid plate. If you've owned a TF2 for a while and you've driven it for a while, you know that the skid plate is not your favorite thing. It hangs down low. It has an awkward shape so that it actually winds up catching on a lot of things that it really shouldn't be even anywhere near to begin with. And what I mean by that is that because of its design, it tends to dig into things more than it should. So if we take our skid plate, this is the stock skid plate for a stock TF2, and we compare it to the new skid plate that comes in the conversion kit. So if I set these like this, and let me zoom in a little bit here. Okay, let me just get a little bit of contrast item here. There we go. So the first thing that you can see is, number one, this is the boom racing skid plate. And if we hold them up hole to hole, you can start to see how much difference there is in clearance. Okay, so my thumbs here, if those are a rock, you can see how much bigger of a rock you could go over with the boom racing skid plate here. Okay, so the angle is different, which is what allows us to get over rocks better. The other major issue, though, are these curves here. These curves, and these specifically angle points there and here on the other side, tend to dig into things quite a lot as you're driving. You don't have those with the boom racing skid plate. Okay. Obviously it still has some, but they're much further apart. They're tucked up into the chassis more, so that you tend to glide over things, and you have more angles here to create a smoother surface to get up onto a rock and slide over it. Okay, so we're going to set that old skid plate aside. Now the only remaining thing to do is to take off all these parts to the rail. Now these are all going to go back on to the new rails in exactly the same way. So what you can do, if you lift them off like this, is to set their screws right back through. And just set them aside. Although the new rails are designed for a long wheelbase, they do have holes so that you can mount the stock rock sliders. Okay, let's just zoom out a little bit here. Okay, so we'll be able to reuse our stock rock sliders. Obviously that's not a requirement, it's just a feature, and it obviously would depend on what body you want to have, whether or not those rock sliders would even line up with the new body. Okay, oops. Our other body post. And finally our other spring perch hanger. Okay. There we go. So now we can look at the difference between the rails. And because it is a conversion kit, there honestly isn't a lot of difference in terms of the rails themselves, because it is designed to carry all the same stock parts. So if we compare them, you have the same exact type of sockets all the way through, the same type of angles, and so on, but with a few extra holes on the long wheelbase version, as well as things being stretched apart a little bit. Okay, and you have an extra socket. Now, the reason for those things will become clear when we start putting this chassis together. Okay. One of the things that I've experienced with TF2 kits, I've bought a couple of them used before, and I don't know if they were originally a kit, or if it was an RTR, or if it was, whatever the reason. But a tip that I can give you is that I've run into more than one TF2 frame that had a white paste used that was some form of Loctite on the screws. Those frames have been incredibly difficult to get apart. So the tip that I can give you is, if you've never had your frame apart and you weren't the one that put it together, if you run into a screw that is difficult to get out, you can apply heat. The way that Loctite basically works is that it bonds in the absence of oxygen. So when a screw goes in to a socket, it's the threads in here that will start to dry first with the Loctite, because when there's no air there, that's when it actually dries up. Okay? Applying heat to it actually liquefies all of the Loctite that was there, and then you can get the screw out. One or two of the TF2 chassis I've had to apply a lot of heat, so much that it actually discolored the electronics plate. So don't be surprised if you have to apply a fair amount of heat in order to get that Loctite out. I don't know what it is. It's white. That's the only thing I can tell you. So we now have an entire TF2 in pieces. The next step is actually to do everything we just did in reverse. So we're going to take our frame rail, we're going to set it down, and we can start putting on some of these parts that we were just taking off. Okay. So there's those. And we might as well do the other side at the same time here. Okay. There we go. Now we're not going to be running these body posts in this particular case. So we're going to put those to the side. We're not going to use those. If we were going to run these sliders, they again would bolt up in the standard locations. We have along there, okay? But we're not going to do that either in this case, because we don't know what body we're going to be running yet. So we have our frame rails. Now, one of the differences with this, if you're not running those body mounts, is that you can actually bolt together both of the frame rails through the skid plate from the outside. Okay? And the reason you can do that is because the skid plate holes are threaded. Whoops, sorry. The skid plate holes are threaded. So you can run the screws through the outside and directly into the skid plate, and that'll hold everything in place. Okay, so once you have these on, that makes things a little bit easier. Now, two of the things that we need to talk about here, I mentioned before, and these are the additional cross braces that come in the kit. Okay, we'll put this in this order because that's the proper order. This one is the new rear shock tower mount, and you'll see it has all of these holes along this edge, which give you options for changing the angle of your shocks in the rear. It also has this additional tab that comes out, and that tab is used to mount one corner of the receiver box, these corners here. That's partly how we get it to sit lower in the frame. Okay. This other brace that has the large hole in it, that's actually made to hold the bearing, and that comes in the kit, and so you set that down in. Once you get it lined up, it just slides right in, or pops in I should say, like so. Okay. And then you have the shaft extender. So what this does is the shaft extender runs through the bearing to keep everything nice. Your drive shaft will hook onto the back of this, and then the shaft extender will hook onto the transfer case. So this is how you get a longer drivetrain without using a very long rear drive shaft, which would then hang down quite low into your driving path, which we don't want to have, obviously. Okay. So what we can do is we can start assembling this by assembling, again, one side. Okay. And the way that this sits is, you can see the bearing sits off to one side. That goes on to the left side of the truck. If you're driving on a, for example, a road in the US, it's the driver's side. And that sockets into that point right there. Okay. Alright, there's that. And then we have two more screws to go through and hold the skid plate in place. So just to give you an idea of the way everything is sitting here. And this will sit in place here with the shaft extender on, running through. Okay. Okay. Now, when it comes to these round bars, we're only going to use one of them. And the one we're going to use is the lower one. Okay, and when I say lower one, the original two holes were these two here. One right next to the shock tower brace and one down here next to the front spring mount. Okay, but we're only going to use the bottom one here. All right. On this, you can pretty much thread in by hand. And then take your driver, and you want the screw holes in it to be pointing up. So if you loosen it a little bit, rotate it back, and then tighten it up. Okay, so now you can start to see what's going to happen here. With the receiver box, we're going to have this turned around. So normally it used to sit this way. And so that the holes that are inside the receiver box here sat on top of one of the round bars, and then these two hanging off the back went onto the rear upper bar, the round ones. But we're going to turn that around, set it nice and low down here, will run screws through into the round bar on this side, and then this little tab that we talked about is where the screw goes down through to hold the other part of the receiver box. And there is room there for the lid to be placed down on and then connected in place. Okay. So that's what we need there. We don't have to do anything else with that right now. And then we can put in this piece here. Okay, like so. Now what will happen is this will sit right down on and connect up. So it's a little bit tricky, but not too bad, just tricky to do on camera. There. Okay. You see me reaching off camera here. You actually get some screws that come with the kit for attaching the new pieces, such as the new bearing carrier and the new rear shock tower mount. You can reuse the old screws. The only difference is that with the skid plate, the screws that are included for the skid plate are the exact length you need to go through the frame and through the skid plate. So if I show you here, you can see they barely protrude through. So if you're not using the body mount on the outside, like this previously was, you can use the shorter screws going through the outside. You don't have to run them through the inside. Okay. Okay. There we go. Now, there's a number of different ways you can go from here. What I'm going to do in this case, though, is there's been a lot of questions on whether or not the 2-speed will fit. The single speed will fit, obviously, but there's been questions about the 2-speed. So I'm going to show you that the 2-speed fits. Step 1 is to take the drive shaft extender and put that in place through here. Step 2 is we're going to take and move the shift linkage up and out of the way. We're going to set this down into place roughly, and then we're going to slide it backwards so that we're sliding the output shaft from the transfer case directly into the drive shaft extender. There we go. Okay. And with the kit, you also get 2 new screws for your skid plate, because odds are you've probably damaged that at some point or other. Those screws may not be the nicest, since the stock skid plate does hang down so low. Okay, and then we just need our other 2 screws to put into this side. Okay, so as I showed you, we removed the engine, the transmission, the coupler and the transfer case for the 2-speed transmission as one unit from the original TF2 frame, and we've just reinstalled it into the Boom Racing TF2 long wheelbase frame. All as one unit, fits perfectly fine, just the way it's supposed to. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is just put in the drive pin set screw for the shaft extender. There we go. Now just make sure everything turns nicely. And we can see that it does. Good. Now we can start putting some other pieces back together. So we have 4 screws that come with the receiver box, and like I said, we're going to turn that around, and we're actually only going to be using 2 of these screws. So we'll put the other 2 over here. And the 2 we're going to be using are going to go into these outside points here. And that, like I said, will set down on top of the rail here, top of the round bar. And then with the box cover on, you run a screw down through here, and that will hold the whole thing in place. And so now we can put in the screws for that bar. Had one there. So there is one other optional position for the receiver box that you can do, and that is you can take these 2 screw holes here, turn the box around 180 degrees, and run screws up into this rear bar. And that will just move it further back. Alternately, you could get a second box if you needed more space and run 2 boxes. There's room to do both options. Okay, and our next step, we're going to put in our rear bumper mount. That just slides directly in from the rear. And we have these 2 small screws to hold that in place. Oops. Okay. And then we will start to mount our rear suspension / drivetrain assembly. So we take out these step screws again. Okay. There we go. And the lock nuts. These can be a little bit fiddly just to get in the exact right position. There we go. There. And then what we want to set in place are these upper portions. And we want to make sure we get the shocks to be sitting nicely so that they're going to be in the right position when we put everything back together. There. Okay. And then we can put our drive shaft on. Okay. Now, depending on how you want to run your setup, you may want to run shorter shocks in the rear than what you already had in the kit. It's not required, but it is something that you may want to do. But again, that really depends on whether or not you want to run a droop style setup or some other configuration. Oops. So we're just running screws through and into the new shock tower mount. Okay. So there we are. And you can see we have multiple positions for the shocks. I just chose one for right now to have it reassembled at this point. Okay. And now we can begin reassembling our front drivetrain assembly. So we have a number of different components here because we took everything off in one set, keeping everything together. Okay. So one of the first things that we can do is to reattach the drive shaft. Okay. And let's just move this back a little bit here. Okay. So then we need to take out our step screws for the rear leaf mounts. So. And then our servo mount and assembly slides up into the rails from the bottom as the leaf spring slides into its mounts on each side. So. Sometimes it's a little bit easier just to loosen these a little bit, everything to slide into place. And I need to get a slightly better view, so excuse me here. There we go. There. If we install the shock mounts, that kind of holds everything loosely together so it doesn't try to jump all over the place on us now. There we are. And once we have our step screws fully inserted, we can put on the lock nuts for those. Okay. This time I'm going to turn it around just to make this a little easier for me. is this one gets a little bit hidden behind the transmission. So you just have to figure out which way works best for you to hold these all in place. There we are. Okay. I'll turn it back around so we were lined up the way we were before. And we have a couple more screws to put in for the front of the front shock towers. We'll tighten these two back up now that we have every brace lined up properly. So we have the two front shock tower screws and the front screws for the mount and our front hangers. So now we have all of our braces installed. We can go and take out the last of our step screws and install the front leaf hangers. One. Okay. Okay. Now you may be noticing we have a ton of screws left back there. and we are going to be using those. A lot of them have to do with this mass of electronics that we took off. Okay. So, first up, we had our electronics plate. Let's just tidy this up a little bit here. Okay. So that sits down in that position there. Okay. Now these two screws here are what would have been our original screws for the skid plate. And in theory, if you've been running your truck for a while, these are probably pretty gross and corroded and scratched up and everything else. So we'll put those to the side like that was the case with those there. Now, one of the next steps that we had was to set our bumper back in place. That's these two small screws here. Now, you may have a different bumper with your TF2, but it uses the same basic mount, so the screws are exactly the same. There. Okay. And then, this gets a little tricky just because we're trying to plunk all of these things back together in the same sort of location they were in before. And all the wires are hooked together. But we have our mount here for our shifting servo. So that's going to sit here. With these two screws. Okay, like so. And then essentially, we can wrap this all back up very much the way that it was. We still got a little bit of sticky tape there. We can set that one down on there. And we have our servo wire. If you remember, it was originally wrapped around here. And through here. And it connected to this plug here. Okay. And a lot of this was just kind of floating here. but our receiver was actually plugged into the box. And in this particular case, because of the way this has been zip tied together or cable tied together, there we go. We can't set it exactly in, but we can now move it, and now it will fit in place. Our motor wires were run also through here along the chassis rail and would be soldered back into place, as well as our winch wires running down along the chassis rail there. Everything cable tied in place. So this whole mess we would take care of and place into the box properly, which it was not done that way before. Okay, so that is the full assembly for the Boom Racing TF2 long wheelbase conversion kit. And this is where you would finish up. So your case for your cover, I should say, would slide in here. And like I said, this truck did not come with one. But then you can run a screw down through this new mount, which is included with the kit. That's just threading that hole for the very first time. And so then your lid would sit there on top, so that's all firmly in place now. Let's see. So if we just remove our electronics out of the picture here for a moment again, set that wire over here, and we'll pry this off and set it over here. We can see, number one, that the 2-speed transmission fits absolutely fine. The single-speed transmission would also fit. You will either need the longer straight coupler, which RC 4-wheel drive includes in some of the TF2 versions that have the single speed, or you can buy a short drive shaft. It'll give you the coupling there at the distance you need, and just like the drive shafts underneath, will give you the ability to change distances that slight amount to match exactly what you need there. And essentially, it's exactly the same. It's just now a 313 millimeter wheelbase, and if we turn it up this way, here, and let me just put a piece of white card underneath just to give you a little more contrast, you can now see, if I set this exactly there, you can now see just how little of the transfer case is poking out below the frame rail. So here we have the frame rail, and here we have the transfer case skid plate. So it's a very, very small amount. If we go and try and compare that, I think we can fit that in there just barely, maybe. There. That's roughly in position, and you can just see how much more that sticks out. It's not exact, but we're within a millimeter or so. And you can see just how much that sticks out now with the included skid plate versus the factory skid plate here. So you have this much more ground clearance, plus, as we already discussed, the better approach angle and departure angle because of the newly shaped skid plate. So it does not have these sharp edges. It does not have these sharp corners on either side. Again, factory skid plate, Boom Racing skid plate. Also, again, available as a separate piece. So you do not have to buy the conversion kit to get the skid plate. If you do not want to go long wheelbase, that is available as a separate part. If you want to go long wheelbase, it is included in the kit. So now, got a little stuck on the double-sided tape still on the speed control there. Now we can run a 313 millimeter wheelbase, and in that category we have the Killer Body LC70 body, we have the Team Rafi Jeep Cherokee body, the Team Rafi LC80, which is a Toyota Land Cruiser body, Tamiya's Toyota Tundra body is also a 313 millimeter wheelbase. You have, of course, a ton of Lexan bodies because Axial has an SCX-10 313 millimeter wheelbase. So there's a lot of Lexan bodies that can fit. Or you have the RC four-wheel drive's four-door Hilux body. So there's a lot of different options now with the longer wheelbase. It's a very different crawling experience if you've never driven a longer wheelbase and you've only been driving, say, the shorter Hilux. So I definitely recommend giving it a try. And that's it.
So that's the Boom Racing TF2 LWB or long wheelbase conversion kit. If you're just looking for higher center ground clearance, the skid plate is available separately. Otherwise, it's included in the kit. As always, thank you for watching, thank you for liking, thank you for subscribing. If you're not already subscribed, please do so, and make sure you ring the bell so you get notified of all of our future updates. And if you have any questions, ask down below in the comments, and I'll be sure to respond as soon as I can. Thanks, see you next time.